The Unraveling. The house was quiet, except for the soft clink of dishes as Claire cleared the dinner table in their suburban home located on Maple Street, where they had built their life together for over a decade. Ethan sat in the living room with the television playing some documentary he wasn't really watching, his mind wandering to the stack of emails waiting for him at the office. Another late night would probably be necessary to stay on top of the Morrison account that had been consuming most of his mental energy for weeks. Claire paused in the kitchen doorway, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter. She had practiced this moment 1,000 times in her mind, rehearsing the words and predicting his reaction, but now that the moment was finally here, her courage felt like it was slipping through her fingers like sand. 15 years together since high school, when they had carved their initials into the old oak tree at Lincoln Park. And now, she was about to shatter everything. She walked slowly into the living room and turned off the television. Ethan looked up, startled at the sudden silence and the expression on her face. He knew that look. Something was wrong. "We need to talk," she said, and her voice sounded like it was coming from far away. His stomach dropped instantly. That phrase had never preceded anything good in any relationship he had ever heard about. But he sat up straighter and gestured to the seat beside him, trying to prepare himself for what might come. "I did something," she began, and the words tumbled out faster as her anxiety overwhelmed her careful planning. "I wasn't thinking clearly, and I was lonely, and you were always working, and I made a mistake, Ethan." She took a breath and continued. "I slept with Marcus from my office last night." The room fell silent, so completely that Ethan could hear the neighbor's dog barking in the distance and the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. He stared at her face, searching for some sign that this was a joke or a test of some kind, but her eyes were red and wet and filled with desperate hope and fear that maybe he would forgive her. His mind raced through the events of the previous evening. He had indeed worked late, staying at the office until nearly midnight to finish the quarterly reports for the Morrison account. When he came home, Claire was already in bed, or so he had thought. She had seemed normal this morning, making coffee and kissing his cheek before he rushed out the door again. Ethan thought about all the little moments he had noticed recently, the distance that had grown between them like a slowly widening chasm, the way she turned away from him in bed, the way she smiled less, the way she spent hours on her phone when she thought he wasn't looking. He had wanted to address it, to talk to her, to fix whatever was breaking, but work had consumed him, and he had convinced himself that things would improve once he got through this busy season. His mouth opened and closed as his brain struggled to process the information, but when he finally spoke, his voice came out flat and eerily calm, almost as if someone else was speaking through him. "Congrats," he said. Claire froze, her face crumpling as if she had been physically struck. She had expected anger. She had expected tears. She had expected him to yell or cry or demand answers. Instead, his single-word response hung in the air between them like a guillotine blade, and it was so much worse than any explosive reaction could ever have been. "What?" she whispered. His detachment was suffocating, and it terrified her far more than rage ever could have. The finality in that single word seemed to encompass everything that their marriage had become, a hollow shell of what it once was, a structure that was crumbling from the inside out. As Ethan turned back to the television and resumed watching the documentary as if she had merely told him about the weather, Claire felt her world tilt on its axis. She had hoped that honesty might be the beginning of repair, but instead, it felt like she had opened a door to a room where their love had already died, and she simply hadn't noticed the funeral.
The silence between them. The days that followed were suffocating in their ordinariness. Claire woke each morning hoping that perhaps Ethan had processed the information and would finally speak to her about what happened. But instead, he moved through their home like a ghost, disappearing into the garage before dawn and returning long after she had gone to bed. He had taken to sleeping in the guest room, claiming he was snoring more lately, but they both knew the truth was far more complicated. She tried everything. She cooked his favorite meals, homemade lasagna with garlic bread, the way his mother had taught her, but he would eat in silence, barely tasting it. She attempted conversations, starting with weather and current events, anything to break through the wall of indifference he had constructed. But he would respond with single-word answers before excusing himself. She even waited for him one evening in the living room, wearing the blue dress he had always loved, the one from their anniversary trip to Charleston. But when he saw her, he simply nodded and walked past her to the stairs. Claire spent hours replaying her decision, wondering how she had allowed herself to betray everything they had built with Marcus. She had told him about Ethan and her troubles at home, and he had listened with such apparent care, offering her drinks and attention when Ethan was working late. It had started innocently enough, late conversations in the office, breaking down barriers, until one night, after everyone else had left, they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Now she realized how foolish she had been, how easily she had thrown away something real for something temporary. The guilt was eating her alive. She would lie awake at night, listening to the silence of the guest room, knowing Ethan was there, but feeling the distance between them as if they were separated by an ocean. But what made it worse was that his silence felt almost like agreement, as if he too believed she was unforgivable. She tried to imagine what he was thinking in those long, sleepless nights. Was he planning to leave her? Was he already consulting divorce attorneys in his mind? One Thursday evening, Claire made a decision. She called in sick to work and waited for Ethan to come home from his job. She needed him to speak to her, to express his anger or his pain. Anything would be better than this awful, terrible silence. When he walked through the door, she stood in front of him, blocking his path to the stairs. "Please," she said, and her voice broke. "Please, just tell me what you are feeling. Tell me you hate me. Tell me you want a divorce. But please stop this silent treatment because I cannot bear it anymore." Ethan looked at her, and for a moment she saw something flicker across his face. Pain, resignation, maybe even sadness. But then his expression hardened again, and he sidestepped her, moving toward the stairs. "There is nothing to say, Claire. Everything has already been said." He spoke quietly, but each word felt like a knife wound. That night, Claire realized something terrifying. Ethan was not angry at her infidelity. He was grieving the marriage that he had already lost, and her confession had simply confirmed what he had long suspected, that they were no longer connected, that somewhere along the way, they had become strangers, living in the same house.
2 weeks had passed since Claire's confession, and the tension in the house had become almost unbearable, like a pressure cooker with no release valve. On a Saturday morning, when Ethan tried to slip out as usual, Claire finally snapped. She grabbed his arm as he headed toward the garage. "You need to tell me something," she demanded, her voice shaking with desperation and anger. "Why do you not care? Why are you not even trying to fight for us?" Ethan pulled his arm away, and for the first time since her confession, he truly looked at her. And when he spoke, his words were deliberate, and each one landed like a bomb. "I stopped fighting a long time ago," he said quietly. "When was the last time you looked at me? Really looked at me? When was the last time we laughed together, or held hands, or did anything that resembled what a marriage should be?" He paused and continued. "I realized months ago that I had been holding on to a ghost of what we used to be. I kept thinking that if I worked harder, if I pushed through this busy season, if I just gave it more time, something would change, but nothing did. You felt it too, did you not? You felt the distance, so you looked for comfort elsewhere. Claire's tears came fast and hard, because he was right. Everything he said was true, and she had known it for months. She had felt the slow death of their connection, and instead of fighting for it, she had run from it, into Marcus's arms. "But I love you," she whispered. "And I love you too," Ethan said, and his voice cracked for the first time, revealing the pain he had been hiding. "All this time, I have loved you. But love is not always enough, is it? Sometimes two people can love each other and still destroy each other." He walked toward the door, and Claire realized with sudden horror that he was leaving, not just for the day, but perhaps for good. "Wait," she cried out. "Where are you going?" "I need space," he said without turning around. "I need to think about what comes next, and I cannot do that here." As his car pulled out of the driveway, Claire stood alone in the kitchen and felt the finality of it all. Their marriage, which had started with carved initials on an old oak tree and promises of forever, was now collapsing into itself, and she had no idea if there was any way to rebuild what they had broken, or if the damage was simply too great to repair.
Falling apart completely. 3 weeks had passed since Ethan left, and Claire had barely slept a full night. She had called his phone countless times, but he never answered. Eventually, she discovered he was staying with his friend Thomas across town, a small apartment where he was apparently rebuilding his life without her. She tried to respect his space, but the anxiety and desperation were consuming her. She showed up at his office one afternoon hoping to catch him, but his secretary informed her that he had taken time off work. The fear that gripped her was unlike anything she had ever experienced because she suddenly understood that Ethan might not come back. This was not some dramatic fight that would blow over in a few days with passionate reconciliation and tears of forgiveness. This was the slow, painful dissolution of everything they had built together, and she was powerless to stop it. Meanwhile, Claire had made a terrible mistake. She had continued to see Marcus, believing foolishly that perhaps if she explored what she was feeling with him, she might find some clarity. Instead, what she found was emptiness. Marcus had seemed so attentive when she was married, but now that she was available, he treated her with casual indifference. She realized with crushing shame that he had never really wanted her. He had simply wanted the thrill of seducing another man's wife. And once the excitement faded, he lost interest. One evening, Claire received a call from an unknown number, her heart racing as she answered, only to hear Ethan's voice, calm and formal, informing her that he had contacted a divorce attorney. He did not raise his voice or express anger. He simply stated facts, that he would be filing in the coming weeks and that his lawyer would be in touch with her. He said it the way someone might discuss a business transaction, and that detachment hurt worse than any shouted argument ever could. She begged him to reconsider, to go to counseling with her, to give their marriage one more chance, but Ethan remained resolute. His decision had been made during those 3 weeks alone. He had called his mother, who had reminded him that he deserved to be happy, that staying in a broken marriage out of obligation was not noble, it was self-destructive. He had spent hours talking to Thomas, who had encouraged him to prioritize his own mental health and well-being. Claire finally heard the truth that Ethan had been waiting for when she asked him point blank, "Do you still love me?" And he responded, "I do, but I am no longer in love with you." Those words were the final nail in the coffin because they represented something he could not fight against. You cannot force someone to feel something they have stopped feeling, and that was where they had arrived. As she hung up the phone, Claire realized that her infidelity had not destroyed their marriage. Her infidelity had merely revealed what was already broken. It had been the symptom, not the disease. And now she had to live with the consequences of ignoring the warning signs for so long.
6 months later, the divorce was finalized, and their suburban home sold. Claire moved into a small apartment across town from where Ethan was living. They had divided their possessions with painful precision, each item a reminder of a life that no longer existed. The carved wooden box where they kept old tickets from movies and concerts, the photo albums from their wedding and honeymoon, the matching coffee mugs they had bought on their first trip to Maine, all of it divided into his and hers. Claire had thrown herself into therapy, finally facing the patterns of avoidance that had led her to seek comfort with Marcus instead of fighting for her marriage. She had learned hard truths about herself, about how she had used his neglect as permission to betray him, about how she had been running away from her own unhappiness instead of addressing it. She was not a bad person, but she had made bad choices, and she would carry that weight forever. Ethan had also changed in those months. He had thrown himself into his career initially, but eventually realized that chasing work success had been part of the problem. He had started dating again, though cautiously, knowing that his trust had been wounded. He would sometimes see old photos of him and Claire and feel a strange mixture of sadness and relief that he was no longer trapped in that dying marriage. One autumn morning, 6 months after moving into her apartment, Claire was at the coffee shop near her office when she saw Ethan. He was with a woman she did not recognize. They were laughing together, and the woman had her hand on his arm. The pain Claire felt in that moment was sharp and immediate, but underneath it was something else. Recognition. Perhaps that this was how it had to be, that they had run their course, and now they were each trying to find their way toward happiness independently. Ethan saw her, and their eyes met for just a moment. He smiled sadly, and she nodded back in acknowledgement. It was not a happy ending, not really, but it was an ending, and sometimes that was all you could ask for. As Claire sat alone with her coffee, she thought about the 17 years she had spent with Ethan. And she did not regret them. She regretted how they had ended, but not that they had happened. At Lincoln Park, the old oak trees still stood with their initials carved into it, but their story had been rewritten by choices and consequences, and the painful truth that sometimes love is not enough to hold two people together. She would carry Ethan with her always, but she would also move forward, because that was what broken people had to do.